The 1949 New Zealand general election took place on the 29th and 30th of November 1949 to elect a total of 80 MPs to the 29th session of the New Zealand Parliament. In the aftermath of World War II, New Zealand found itself at a crossroads. The war had brought significant changes to the nation, and the upcoming general election of 1949 would determine the path forward for this resilient island country. At the heart of this political landscape were two formidable opponents, the Labour Party led by the Prime Minister, Peter Fraser, and the National Party led by Sidney Holland. Each vied for the opportunity to shape New Zealand's future. After 14 years in government, Labour's popularity was at an all-time low. It was clear to most Kiwis that Peter Fraser was tired and worn out as he struggled to deal with the pressing issues of the day. The biggest challenges facing the country were the after effects of World War II, particularly rationing and shortages. New Zealand also found itself embroiled in an ideological conflict. The relationship between Western nations and the Soviets soured dramatically after the end of World War II. This conflict became known as the Cold War, characterized by a state of non-military conflict, propaganda and proxy wars. The Cold War emerged from the competing political and economic ideologies of capitalism and communism. It was marked by an intense nuclear arms race, espionage and ideological struggles for influence across the globe, with both superpowers seeking to expand their spheres of influence and prevent the spread of their rivals' ideology. While direct military confrontation between the two superpowers was avoided, the Cold War had profound implications for international relations, shaping the world order and influencing conflicts and alliances on a global scale. During this period, Fraser and Labour would continue their progressive agenda. In 1947, Fraser would appoint Mabel Howard, Member of Parliament for the Christchurch seat of Sydenham, to Cabinet. Howard became New Zealand's first woman Cabinet Minister when she was made Minister of Health and Minister in charge of Child Welfare. Ms Howard would also gain worldwide attention, being the first woman Cabinet Minister in the world outside of Britain. Speaking of Britain, New Zealand would move a step away from her that same year when the government introduced and passed the Statute of Westminster Adoption Act 1947. The Statute of Westminster Act was originally passed by the British Parliament in 1931 to give its dominions like Canada, Australia and New Zealand more autonomy and independence. New Zealand did not adopt the statute until 1947 on account of loyalty to the British Empire, and was the last dominion to do so. The statute allowed New Zealand to take its own foreign policy stances and took away the ability of the British Parliament to have control over New Zealand's laws. The Act also enabled the New Zealand Parliament to create New Zealand citizenship, which it did with the passing of the British Nationality and New Zealand Citizenship Act 1948. To the opposition now, and Sid Holland and the National Party were riding high. Holland had managed to keep his party together and were now benefiting from the public's dissatisfaction with Labour. National heavily attacked Labour for their rationing policies, dubbing Finance Minister Walter Nash as the dress dictator for his refusal to end rationing for clothing products. National argued that with the war now over, there was no need for continued rationing, and if elected, they would end the policy. National also promised to build more houses. Following the war, there was a huge demand for housing, particularly state houses. Labour were falling drastically behind with housing construction, and many ex-servicemen and their families were becoming frustrated with the long waiting times, despite being given priority status for houses. National promised to build more houses and get rid of the bureaucracy that was stifling development. Interestingly enough, despite taking over a decade to do so, National had now come to terms with the welfare state and saw both its popularity and benefit. However, now the Nats argued that Labour were poorly handling the welfare state and that they could do a much better job of running it. Back to the government now, and Labour were becoming their own worst enemy in the lead up to the election, alienating much of their core supporters. A strike by the Auckland Carpenters Union exposed cracks in the Labour movement, and the government's handling of the dispute, which involved deregistration of the Auckland branch of the Carpenters Union, was deeply unpopular among many unionists. However, most damaging was the compulsory military training referendum of August 1949, which would allow the continuation of conscription. With the threat of war with the Soviet Union looming, the Prime Minister felt New Zealand had to be prepared for war, and felt the best way to do so would be through conscription. If passed, the government could call up any fit and able man between 18 and 45 to be conscripted into one of the three branches of the military. This policy had always been opposed by the Labour Party. Fraser was called a hypocrite for this new stance. He had been jailed during World War I for opposing conscription, and even into the 1920s he said that compulsory military training was out of date, inefficient, and not worth the money spent on it. On August 3rd, the results were in, and 77.9% of Kiwis were in favour of CMT, while only 22.1% were against it. Many of the no votes were in Labour electorates, and this spelt doom for the party. To the campaign now, and Sid Holland's National Party had a field day. Rationing and the shortage of consumer goods boosted their arguments that Labour strangled the economy and freedom of choice. While Labour's achievements had been enormous, Fraser could only hark back to what he had done with the slogan, "Don't gamble with prosperity," and "an era of plenty." But it seemed voters wanted more than the status quo. And the winner was Sid Holland and the National Party with 46 seats, a gain of 8 and 52% of the vote. This result was never really in doubt throughout the campaign, and the Nats would triumphantly march to victory, winning most rural and suburban seats. Labour would be thrown from office, losing 8 seats to hold 34 and 47% of the vote. Conceding defeat in Wellington, outgoing Prime Minister Fraser was greeted with boos. 14 years on from their landmark victory in 1935, the tide had finally turned for Labour. Sydney George Holland would be sworn in as New Zealand's 25th Prime Minister on December 13th, 1949. And now to end this video, here's Prime Minister Holland in his first speech to the nation as Prime Minister.
As the newly elected Government of New Zealand, my colleagues and I enter upon our great task in high hopes of providing an administration that will merit the respect and endorsement of the people we have been chosen to serve.